Right. Welcome everybody to this AI ethics seminar with Emma Engström from the Institute for Future Studies in Stockholm. She will talk about a new world with AI-driven decisions, implications for privacy, autonomy, and democracy. We are recording the talk. You should feel free to ask questions in the chat during the presentation, which will take maybe 45 minutes, and we can then bring them up in the Q&A after that. So most welcome to everyone, and especially to Emma. Emma, please go ahead.
Thank you, Ole. I'm very happy to be here, talk to you, and I'm going to present ongoing research within WASP-HS project. And I work at the Institute for Future Studies and here at KTH, Department of Urban Planning and Environment. So I'm part of a research group at the Institute for Future Studies that are focusing on the social impact of AI applications. And we're a team of sociologists, psychologists, philosophers, mathematicians, and myself. I'm an engineering physicist by training. I studied AI 15 years ago when it still wasn't so good, but now focus is more on the social impact of technology. So I'm not talking really as an engineer here, but more as someone interested in the social implications. Why we're interested in AI is because they are a type of technologies that change over time, and they change in the interaction with humans, and that makes them so dynamic. And there are so many features that appear over time, and we want to understand them and discuss them both on a case-by-case basis and on a societal level. Today I'm going to talk about this WASP-HS funded research project, which we call Predicting the Diffusion of AI Applications. So it's a 5-year project and still ongoing. So we're open to feedback and collaborations if you're interested. So the research questions are quite broad and ambitious. AI, as you know, is a big field of a big chunk of technologies. But we try and approach this topic in terms of these research questions. So one is how do AI applications spread? How have they spread so far? And we're interested in categorizing AIs in terms of their diffusion mechanisms, and we want to compare AI to previous general purpose technologies. So I'm going to talk a little bit on part 1 today. Part 2 is related, but it's instead focusing on factors that can that influence adoption and diffusion, and whether we can use knowledge of those factors to make predictive models of which AIs will be used ahead. And we're interested in using established models of technology adoption, but we're also interested in adding new AI-specific features to those models. And they're related to privacy, autonomy, and transparency, and other AI-specific issues. And we are also interested in discussing the social implications of the AIs that spread fast, and we're interested in discussing the implications of AI's diffusion mechanisms. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that today and in the final part of the presentation. And the first part is mainly based on a published study which focused on mechanisms for spread among consumers. And we approached this topic very open-minded a couple of years back. We were basically, what is consumer AI? What's common about these technologies? So here are some examples: vacuums, their voice assistants, driving assistance systems, and recommender engines. And this image is from the US Patent and Trademark Office, showing AI is about vision, sound, and all these wide range of applications. And so this was hard for us to grapple this large number of different applications, but we found some interesting articles on the topic of the usage of AI without being even aware of it. So even Facebook's director of AI research, Jan LeCun, said most people are already using AI without even realizing. And this was interesting to us because it was different from previous general purpose technologies. So we wanted to dig into this a little bit. And we introduced infusion as a diffusion mechanism for deep learning specifically. So AI is obviously more than deep learning. And but in this study, we focus on deep learning technology specifically. So we come up with this process, which we call DL infusion, which is the act of adding deep learning to another technology to make it better from some perspective. And we categorize into DL infused technology to which a DL feature has been added, but which used to function without it. And DL dependent is a technology that depends on DL for its main functionality. So we make this categorization in this paper. And we make also the point that infused DL is basically a means of diffusion by standard and automatic version updates. And then the challenge for us was to assess the importance of this. And our approach was to look at mobile apps. So we wanted to identify DL in mobile apps. And we found, going through press releases and version logs, that all of the most popular apps use deep learning for recommendations or ranking or categorization. And this was 2019, but so all the popular apps use deep learning and they have massive mobile reach. And because, oh yeah, and then we try to identify exact date of when was deep learning added, but it was a challenge to go through the version logs. App Annie has presented them, but the closest I could find to sort of evidence was this sort of personalized search recommendations, which was obvious in YouTube's mobile app update in 2016 in November. But this is not like foolproof evidence, but we also found in press releases that deep learning was added around this time. And we argue that it's been a key mechanism for deep learning diffusion among consumers because smartphones are so extremely widespread, and 6 out of 10 globally is online, and many use smartphones to access the internet. So it's not likely that any other technology with deep learning has had the same reach. And we argue that infusion has been the key mechanism for diffusion here because deep learning didn't really exist when these apps were launched, because we think that deep learning had its sort of breakthrough in 2012 with this AlexNet's deep convolutional neural network that won the ImageNet challenge in 2012, and after that, sort of deep learning can spread massively in society. And it's interesting for us to relate infusion to other previous models of technology adoption, because there are some big theories out there. The diffusion of innovations by Rogers is one of them, and the technology acceptance models is another. And basically, all of the established models that we found focus on this idea of the conscious consumer choice. So it's basically an individual decides whether to adopt a new technology or not. So we think then that AI is different from these other, it sort of doesn't really fit into these frameworks. And some final notes on part one. So deep learning seems to have spread to consumers by the successive, sometimes hidden and externally controlled version updates. So that's a bit different from previous technology adoption methods. And you know, clearly AI is then similar to any other type of code, such as bug fixes. But the interesting part is the fact that AI is such potentially powerful technology, and I think you're aware of many of those limitations, but AI is not just another bug fix, and that's what makes it interesting. So in part 2, we focus on factors that influence adoption and continued use. And this is really an information systems type of study, so it's not so much focused on AI ethics, but I'm going to describe it to you anyways. And so we start with these 2 categories that we defined in the previous paper, AI-dependent technologies and AI-infused technologies. And we say that it may be different factors influencing adoption in different cases. So in the infused case, there is a kind of someone decides to buy or install an app, and then an enterprise or the app provider decides to add an AI technology, and then I, as a user, decide whether to use that technology or not, at least in the case of recommender systems, which we focus on in this study. So the aim is to identify the factors that can explain the variation in usage across different recommender features. And we use this so-called UTAUT, which is well-cited theory of technology adoption in the literature. And basically, there are 7 factors that are supposed to influence adoption. And yeah, I'm not going to go through them all here, but this is an established theory that we apply. But we argue that some of these factors are not really relevant when it comes to comparing technologies, because they're mainly related to the individual, such as social influence, whether you have many friends or family that can help you. So we use this theory, which is then the theory is that if you know how people perceive these factors, you can predict whether they will use some technology. But we focus on 3 of them, which we think are the most relevant in this case when it comes to comparing technologies. And we also add privacy as a kind of construct that we think may influence adoption, because privacy is something that many think, will influence people's behavior in relation to AI, especially in deep learning form. So we introduced this new construct, and the hypothesis is that these 4 factors will influence whether some AI is actually used. And the methodology is it's a questionnaire among platform users, and we focus on 17 different recommender features. We use these constructs that are established, as well as a new one on privacy concerns. And we are interested in basically correlations between usage and these perceived characteristics. And here are the 17 recommender features, and they're all very popular, and they're in the big mobile apps and platforms. And we the group, they all use the host technology, the app, and they're aware of the feature, and we ask to what extent they use this recommender system. And the results, they show that performance expectancy and effort expectancy, which is basically usefulness and ease of use, they are factors that can predict usage of these apps. At least the variance, it can be explained by these factors. However, hedonic motivations, which is basically whether it's fun to use it, is not so significant. And privacy was not significant at all. No correlation there. So if someone perceives an app to impose on their privacy, that doesn't really, or if influence their adoption of this feature. And then I mean, whether the AI feature infringes on their privacy. Some final notes on part 2. So we explain the variation by these 2 factors in this established model, and this corroborates previous findings. Personal efficiency seems to be a key driver of AI usage. And we see that there is some power in this approach. We can use this feature to predict whether an AI application will be used. And we find no support for the hypothesis that privacy influences adoption. And this relates to the privacy paradox, which is the idea that many individuals state that they're worried about privacy, but they don't do really much to protect their private information online. And some future studies here, my colleague is looking at other forms of AI and using a similar approach. And we are also interested in looking at these other AI-specific factors. Here we focus on privacy concerns, but there are many other factors or like potentially problematic aspects of AI that could influence adoption. And Carter et al. Lists some of them, but it's risks for biases and unfair treatment, limited interpretability, risk for reduced human control and autonomy, and lack of common sense, unpredictable errors, and descaling over time. So these are some well-known kind of potential limitations of AI. And the part 3 is focusing on the social consequences of AI's diffusion mechanisms, and this is work in progress, and some of what I talk about here has been discussed in these previous studies, but we're also developing this part. So if you want to contribute here or have feedback, I'm very much open to your comments. And the background then is basically our findings in terms of these 2 or 3 previous studies, that AI, especially AI today, AI in the form of deep learning, most of the most common applications, they need behavioral data to function well. And so, but the challenge here is that privacy concerns do not seem to influence potential adoptees. So if users are not concerned about privacy when they're sort of exposed to AI, then there is not really much of an incentive for suppliers to kind of address this issue. And so here there is a role to play for policymakers, and the AIs that have spread the fastest, they have been added inconspicuously and successively to pre-existing products or services, connected technologies. We focus on apps, but another study looks at IoT and other connected devices. But and decision support, like AI in various forms, is often in the form of a decision support in various forms, such as recommender system. So if you combine these 2, facts, then we get the title of the talk, The World with AI-Driven Decisions. So here is where there's something interesting happening. It's this idea that we're surrounded by connected technologies that are sort of externally controlled, and some of them have this sort of decision support function that's now kind of influence our decision making. So the aim of the study is to identify and discuss the implications of this. And one thing to note is by diffusion, this mechanism that we identify in the first paper, it's that it benefits the largest platforms that already have a lot of users, because that's when they can access. But if they, by this means of diffusion, can kind of add an AI to this technology, then they can access behavioral data, which they can use to develop their services. And that kind of creates this sort of positive feedback loop that makes it very hard for smaller companies to compete. And there are some slides to support this idea, but basically deep learning, which is, in my view, kind of driving this new current AI kind of wave, or the fact that AI is now such an important part of the big conversation in society. Deep learning needs a lot of data, and so this really benefits the ones with access to that data. And so older algorithms, they're not sort of improving with if you already have a lot of data, but if you add some more, that doesn't really change the performance of all the. And the Economist notices the same thing from the kind of perspective of companies. They have their approach on things, and they notice that there is this kind of binary, adoption of or successful implementation of machine learning. Either you're one of the few big tech companies and then works out, but smaller companies often struggle to handle this or make use of this technology. And another important feature of AI then, or AI for decision support, is the fact that there are so many stakeholders involved. And this is on the graphics to illustrate that. So we have an AI user, and society is obviously some kind of stakeholder here, or we have a national approach to artificial intelligence in Sweden, saying that AI applications should be ethical, safe, secure, reliable, and transparent. We also have friends or family, and there are studies showing that people think their kin use their phones too much. So it's not only the individual, but anyone who's surrounding this person. There are app developers who want to promote engagement, and this is from Facebook's IPO. And so they're obviously interested in increasing engagement in their app, and they're using AI to do that. And we have advertisers. They are using these big platforms for targeted ads. And we also have financiers, basically ourselves, but in our retirement savings. So we want apps to flourish by using AI. So Crandall's complaint, that's a fun kind of concept that I came across, which is Crandall was former CEO of American Airlines, or he is the former CEO of American Airlines. And in the U.S. hearing in Congress, he argued, because they had been accused of manipulating a flight reservation system. Sort of when people booked flights, they were recommended to use American Airlines' own flights. And in the hearing, he said, the preferential display of our flights is the competitive raison d'etre for having created the system in the first place, which is fun. So he's sort of very open about the fact that they use this algorithm for basically manipulating users. And this is an old case. In 1984, the US enacted this display of information, which is a law that says that reservation system for flights should be able to account for order in which flights are presented and weights given to parameters. So this is a very old example of a similar challenge that policymakers face today. And it is well known in empirical science that users are influenced by personalized recommendations. There are plenty of data to support that. Spotify, Facebook, this is a bit pertinent because it's saying that 64% have become members by members in extremist groups by means of recommendation systems that were optimized to increase usage. And this is according to their own internal analysis in Wall Street Journal. This was published. And YouTube, apparently 70% of time spent is based on recommendations, and there are some similar numbers for Netflix. And the consumers, according to this survey, are influenced by personalization when it comes to purchasing decisions. So there is some power here because statistically these systems work. Maybe not for you right now, but as a group, we are influenced by these systems. So there's a power to them. And clearly you can kind of identify these potential conflicts of interest, and these conflicts, they relate to many different things. For instance, radicalization in terms of the content consumed on YouTube. There are some studies showing that people consume increasingly polarized content over time. And there's also studies to show that Young women suffer from anxiety and depression by using Instagram. So that sort of suggests that there is this kind of conflict of interest between users and AI providers. And there is some Swedish data saying that 80% uses social media here, but 40% thinks it's more or less meaningless. And at the same time, the time that young people spend on this YouTube has increased by double in 4 years. And this relates to this academic discussion on nudges and cognitive biases and kind of attention economics that we're part of. And this is work that dates back to Herbert Simon in the 50s, but by means of Kahneman and Tversky and other behavioral economists, we have sort of clarified that people are influenced by the choice environments. And this is Taylor and Sunstein saying that people make choices in relation to decision choice architectures, but nudges can be kind of positive ways of promoting a choice without limiting freedom of choice. And this is kind of a positive take on nudges, but then there's this other academic discussion that's sort of criticizing this concept when it comes to online so-called hypernudges. And Jan argues that if you have online nudges powered by big data, that means that there are new methods for retrieving and user information. And there are new methods to influence the user so old methods like normal advertising, that's basically static and generic, whereas targeted advertising is so dynamic and interactive and adapted to the individual. So it's much more powerful in this sense. And it's also the fact that people sort of increasingly perceive the world through these digital platforms, and the technology becomes increasingly invisible and not real question. So it's perceived as neutral, and so we think that the online world is not, it's kind of a neutral space to explore the world, but it's now kind of beginning to sink in how it's maybe not. And clearly this is an old study, but it's still pretty cool. It's showing how you can use these online data to infer very personal characteristics such as sexual orientation or intelligence. And there are more, this is an old study, but there are newer ones show it based on images, not only likes, but like, just the way you look, you can infer a lot of features now with deep learning. But the idea is essentially the same, that you use this kind of inconspicuous data to infer very personal characteristics. And so this is just a fun slide showing the hyper nudges that I get, which is basically these sort of books kind of criticizing this new domain, like the Master or Slave, Shoshana Zuboff book there. Oh, so that's kind of fun. And some arguments against hypernudging in literature. So these are philosophers, I think, or lawyers, kind of digging into this concept of manipulation. So it's this idea of secretly influencing a person's decision making, and it's this idea that manipulation can undermine autonomy, and because autonomy is the ability to make one's own decisions, and this is not only the big ones, but also the kind of minor everyday decisions. And the kind of prerequisite here is that you have competence, you have the abilities, cognitive and psychological abilities to make deliberate choice and act on your intentions, and authenticity. So you should be able to critically reflect on values and kind of affirm your decisions for your own reasons. And manipulation kind of undermines that, because you're not aware of your that your choice environment has been manipulated to influence your decision making, which relates to this to your competence to make decisions, and also this idea of authenticity, because you cannot motivate your decisions. At least they're not like, you cannot motivate them as your own. And Shoshana Zuboff, she has written a book on this concept she calls surveillance capitalism, and she's interested in this system in which personal behavior is used for prediction technologies, and this is used to influence our behavior and kind of sell behavior, and by means of new business models that kind of based on targeted ads. So she sort of questions the whole idea that targeted ads is a good business model. And she distinguishes between conventional capitalism, which is companies sell things to their clients, which are individuals, with this surveillance capitalism that focuses like the client is the ad buyer, but we somehow are the product here. And he argues that this is fundamentally problematic because it's about steering individuals. And it's notable here that all the big AI companies today are selling targeted ads. So to me, this is very clearly something that relates to artificial intelligence. And these are kind of old slides from AI providers, but in a sense, I think maybe Mark Zuckerberg wouldn't say this thing today, that privacy is no longer a social norm, but I still think that because of Facebook's fundamental business model, it's somehow in Facebook's interest that people share a lot of private information, either deliberately or just by means of using apps in different ways and sharing behavioral data online. So that's sort of fundamental to their business model. So it doesn't really matter to me. Well, I mean, it matters to me that Zuckerberg is interested in privacy, but I think the point he made in 2009 is still somehow important to consider. And likewise, Google's previous chairperson, Eric Schmidt, argued that, you know, if you want to be private, you shouldn't really kind of, if you don't want something to be noticed, you shouldn't do it in the first place. That's basically his argument here. So that basically means that people should be prepared to have their information collected by Google. So sure, I'm sure that Google has updated its policies in relation to privacy, but still Google is also a targeted ads driven company. And Shoshana Zuboff, she kind of argues against this in terms of like privacy is sort of essential to this idea of individuation and autonomy, and you have to try out different ideas. That's sort of essential to this democratic process of deliberation. And if someone is monitoring you when you do that, that's fundamentally problematic for the democratic process. And well, there are other people arguing along similar lines that you're not really kind of free in a surveillance state. You're not able to kind of deliberate on different positions because you're afraid to articulate something that may not be politically correct at this moment in time. And Zuboff argues that privacy is a collective good, a public good. So we need, all of us need other people to maintain their privacy, because it's sort of a premise for democracy. This is how she argues. And there are studies, empirical studies, to support this idea that surveillance can induce self-censoring, and this is a study from 2013, which argues that after this NSA PRISM surveillance kind of scandal or revelation, maybe, that there was data transferred to the US government from the big tech companies. People were more kind of secretive online. They were not going to the same Wikipedia sites as they did before. And then like private, kind of sensitive Wikipedia sites. And they argue here that it's this kind of chilling effect, self-censoring is a challenge with online privacy. And they argue that this is kind of deterring people from exercising their rights to the freedom to think and communicate privately. And Frank Pasquale has discussed this in his books, and this relates to the Swedish national approach to AI, the fact that AI applications should be ethical, safe, and transparent and reliable. And he argues that because we don't know how recommender systems work, we cannot know if they're kind of pushing their own products or the app provider's own kind of alternatives, such as Amazon, or if they're just kind of neutral in their presentation of their results. So there are kind of fundamental problems with us being sort of influenced by these systems that steer our decision making, and many argue. And some final notes on part 3 is that, you know, there are great advantages to AI spread by infusion, which is if you think that AI is unambiguously great, it is very fast. So if you have all these people, these billions of people using the big platforms, and AI is sort of pushed into these interfaces and these apps, if AI is all great, we don't have a problem. It's just a very fast means of taking advantage of this new technology. But some argue against that, and many kind of argue on the basis of this idea of the limitation of consumer power, because it's an enterprise that has decided to add this AI, and it's not the individual who has decided to, okay, now AI is a great thing for me to use. And so there's this kind of power shift from the individual to a few large tech actors. And another important point here is that providers are not kind of, they may be loath to investigate the negative implications of their algorithms, such as this fact of Instagram revelations. That was Facebook's own analysis revealed that Instagram kind of induced anxiety and depression among teenage girls, but they didn't present this to the public, I think, until it was revealed by this Wall Street Journal article. That's what I think. I don't know all the details. And some other final notes. So an inherent aspect of the AI technologies that are kind of widespread today is that they become more powerful if they use more data. And considering then that people don't seem to consider privacy when they use AI in the form of recommender systems, like, because AI providers will have this obvious incentive to, you know, encourage people to share more. There is no reason to expect that they will kind of limit their own data-hungry behavior. And there are many who argue there against this system of targeted ads, mainly, that sort of, you know, pushes this AI providers and big tech platforms to collect as much data as possible and use in prediction of human behavior. And surveillance is then kind of conceptualized as something fundamentally problematic in terms of its potential limits on intellectual freedom mind. And Sibov, I finalized with a quote from her, which is, she's arguing that the centralization of data knowledge and surveillance power is the defining challenge for the future of the market economy. And yeah, I'm a bit inclined to agree with her. Thank you. That was my final slide.
Thank you very much, Emma. May I suggest we give her a round of virtual applause.
Thank you.
And there has not been very much action in the chat room, so I'm going to simply let you unmute and speak up if you have questions or comments. Please go ahead. Philip, you want to say something?
Thanks. Yeah, so I have a question. So, so where do you draw the line between, say, AI and machine learning and more traditional statistical methods? And also, is it an important distinction to make here in this context?
Well, the definition I normally use is that AI is technologies that learn over time, that they change over time, but using data, user data. So that would sort of say that machine learning is a typical type of AI, but maybe they're not traditional statistical methods unless they're sort of improving over time. I mean, you can have a normal linear regression, but if you feed it with user data and you sort of improve the model over time, I guess then it's also AI, even if it's a very conventional regression. So yeah, that's the definition I normally use. But as you noticed, like in the first paper, when we need to kind of identify when was deep learning added or when was AI added, then we need to use a more specific definition in that specific study. But to me, it's not so interesting when we talk AI ethics. I'm not only interested in deep learning, I'm interested in the bigger. But in a specific paper, you may need to be more specific.
Okay.
So then it's more about how increasing amounts of data can make these algorithms improve them, and then yeah.
So I think, and because deep learning seems to me to be the most powerful algorithm right now, I'm kind of focusing on it, but maybe there will be some other algorithm that's also using a lot of data.
Thanks.
Okay, yep.
Emma, can you take down the presentation so we can all see each other a little bit better?
Okay, yeah.
In the meantime, Marie has a question.
Yeah, hello. Thank you for an interesting presentation. I was just wondering, what is the kind of medicine for this kind of discouraging future? Are there any political discussions about this? I mean, we have a systems in the democracies on having the lawmaking bodies kind of trying to match up with the ethics of the society. Are there any such discussions going on in the world?
Yes, Marie, thank you for this question. So I was just asked to take my slides down, but now I take them up because the Digital Services Act, it's kind of very recently enacted. The way I'm not a lawyer, but to me it seems that European Union has decided on this act, and so this means that the very large platforms will have to kind of change their recommender systems. And it means, so some people in the European Parliament, they have argued against targeted ads, like across the board. But apparently there was some disagreement in the European Parliament. So this Charles Mose, she's a Danish parliamentarian. She has kind of argued, no more targeted ads, but there was some disagreement, and there is some compromise. And I think the compromise is that users should be able to select and modify their option for each recommender system.
Okay.
So there is some work, and yeah, I'm kind of impressed actually by the European Union. I think this literature has kind of helped the European Union in addressing it. But of course, there are discussions on whether this actually kind of deals with the big problem, or if it's just kind of now when you visit sites, you're agreeing to the use of cookies or like what kind of but in many argue that in fact users don't really change their behavior much in practice.
But maybe baby step.
Yeah. Well,
it's
a good start. So I'm gonna stop sharing now. Thanks for the question.
So now there are several questions in the chat. In particular, KP has a question. Do you want to unmute and ask it? Oh, sorry, no mic, so I can try and read it aloud. Could you advise how can we influence the trend of how AI technology is developed and how it's used often without respect to people's privacy, of people right to say no to use their data, which actually they can if they want to use today's apps, and others they can't. Okay.
Okay, thanks. I mean, there are many different ways of arguing here. Like one is that we as individuals, as consumers, we should be much more bothered, and there are these alternative search engines that like DuckDuckGo and these kind of approaches to the internet they're not based on targeted ads, this browser. So that's one way to argue we should change our behavior, but I also know from experience that I try and use DuckDuckGo, but in reality I often rely on Google nevertheless. And then the other option is this EU law is promising, but I think also the Swedish we can act as kind of political beings. We can write articles in newspapers and we can vote and we can be kind of active in this debate and try and formulate, if we think this is a problem, we should say so. And I think the Swedish AI policy could also be updated. Now we have this very kind of brief, like 6 pages long strategy to handle AI. And I think it's quite weak, the current Swedish strategy on AI. So that's my comment.
A question from Nadeg.
Yeah, hi. I can ask the question. Do you have any knowledge about how the legal institutions are trying to frame the AI? I'm thinking about like the CAPTCHA system that is used for checking that you are a human. It's actually training the AI in the background, and we are forced to do it. So why is it so?
I'm sorry. I think I'm also kind of saddened to contribute to this with my CAPTCHAs, but like your question is how we should kind of prohibit this practice, or?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
I mean, in terms of the specific CAPTCHAs, I don't know. I'm not an expert on this. I can just say, in general, I'm quite positive towards EU's approach on this, but I cannot give you any more tangible advice in terms of these CAPTCHAs. Do you have any ideas yourself?
Yeah, I was just thinking like, why are we? Why is there any regulation against the CAPTCHA? Because it's actually, it should be like informing the person that is using it that it's actually training AI in the background. And then it's like people are just doing something, but in the end they don't understand what is the consequence of it.
Okay, this is a good point. Maybe there is something on the CAPTCHA in the DSA, but I think the whole point of the DSA is really to share information, like to force big platforms to share information of how their systems are being trained and what data is used. But in case of CAPTCHAs, I don't know.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
Thank you. There's also a question from Beatrice.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So I was thinking that we have plenty of requirements and guidelines and I don't know, standards for safety and for data protection or privacy, I guess. but I was worried about other ethical concerns or considerations. And I was wondering what would be the next step be. So how can we consider these ethical, I don't know how to call it, but the point is, let me see if I can rephrase this question. How can we make companies adapt those high-level requirements or these ethical principles and adapt them in their products? How can we force them? What can authorities do to integrate or to, I don't know, to formulate these ethical principles into, or like standards, like we do for other principles, like things should be safe and things should be secure?
Yeah, that's another challenging question. I mean, I know there's a big scientific discussion on this kind of fairness metrics. So one aspect of this in terms of ethics is this idea that people should be treated fairly. It's not just that some groups should be shown a certain type of ads and another group should be shown another, like women should be shown handbags and men should be shown ads for big cars, you know. So there is an academic debate around metrics and how you can kind of put fairness into an optimization algorithm when you train an AI. But I think it's very difficult because it's sort of translating this kind of general fairness and idea into code, into math. So there is a big discussion around that, and then there is, you can say something like, yeah, companies should share their data or their algorithms so that researchers or like people like myself or Ulle or you guys should be able to access the algorithms and the data and then evaluate whether, you know, is this algorithm fair? Or so I mean, there are some approaches in the literature to these questions, but the way I see it, it's kind of a big landscape of different lines of argument, and it's not very easy to put these ideas into, you know, a legal framework. You know, something like, oh, you can only have ethical algorithms in your software. So it's very challenging.
Tiny follow-up question, if you don't mind. I was wondering, so even if we had some regulation, who should define the criteria for such measurements? So should the companies independently decide how much fairness is okay? It's very difficult.
Yeah.
It's a very difficult concept for me.
Yeah, I mean, for me as well. And I know even this famous case of the Compass algorithm with the US kind of system for advising judges on who gets bail, and it was a big discussion a couple of years ago in terms of whether it was actually unfair or biased against racial minorities. And the Compass, the company, they argued that no, you know, according to these fairness metrics, it was totally fair and didn't discriminate. And according to the journalists revealing this, they used another fairness metric and they found it to be totally unfair. So I guess then, you know, normally when you have questions like this, you have a kind of democratic process in terms of identifying these, what's the right fairness metric. So, but it sort of calls for very knowledgeable parliamentarians and lawmakers who needs to dig into this very complicated kind of mathematical approaches. So I think it's a big challenge with these technologies that they're kind of very hard to just grasp.
Thank you a lot.
Yeah.
I think I'm more confused than I was at the beginning.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Me too.
Yeah, that was a very good point in the end there. Are there further questions or comments?
Yeah, I have another one, if I may. Yes. How can we improve the awareness of the user actually, so that it's actually they are kind of like aware of what are the implications when they do something?
Well, there is this general awareness, like write articles in newspapers and go to seminars like this. Or there is this possibility that, you know, whenever you have a personalized recommender system, there should be this big kind of box saying, yeah, this system is used to influence your choices in this particular way, and it uses this data. That's basically what I can come up with.
Yeah.
And I think the second is DSA is supposed to address the second one. But if you have other ideas, I am open to that.
Okay, thank you.
Another question from Claudia.
Yeah, maybe I can just clarify. I'm interested in understanding, like, what can specifically more about what does Emma think about the role of users or those that are affected by the outcomes of the system in the development of the system? Like, how can you imagine that they can participate or they can be involved in the design or in the development of such systems?
Oh, yes, that's an interesting. I mean, there's one way, you know, for instance, Google, when you search for some search strings in Google 10 years ago, like women should be, and then Google automatically suggested, you know, women should be silent and okay. Anyways, Google suggested odd things 10 years ago when you were searching for some phrases, and then Google added this little kind of, you can click somewhere on Google saying this search result was offensive, or this search result was, you know, biased against some minority. If, you know, so there is, I know that platforms are somehow trying to make us engaged by clicking and informing them of biased search results, for instance. But maybe you are interested in something else. You're like, how can we as researchers use users, or is that what you're interested in, or do you want? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for example, in my case, I'm interested in AI applications that are applied in the public sector. So,
Yeah.
for example, those systems that are applied in like government offices, government agencies.
Okay.
And then I wonder what could citizens do, you know, like regarding AI systems that will affect them and they are actually even funded by their own taxes that they pay.
Oh, yeah. And so you don't mean government employees, then you mean actual, you mean real, you know, people affected by the decisions.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I cannot come up with anything but like the normal sort of complaints and appeals systems. I mean, we in society, we have the systems for appealing. If you get a fine, you can appeal, right? Like, so is that what you're aiming for? Like a more of a kind of an easier
for example,
way? Yeah. So yeah, sure. I totally support this, but I'm not so knowledgeable. I'm not like a lawyer, and I cannot really kind of detail what such a system would look like. But I think it's a good idea in general if you implement this, because I think a lot of public authorities are kind of inspired and they want to use it because to improve efficiency. But if you implement kind of automated decision making in terms of welfare or social benefits, you should also have this, what you propose, this sort of elaborate system for appeals, because the AI will make mistakes, I think. But I think you may have more to say about this than I do, Claudia, if you do research on this.
Yeah, well, for example, I've been reading a bit about like citizen participation.
Yeah.
For example, but I haven't seen any actual like present existing participation. It's more like on the theoretical aspects.
Okay. Yeah, me too. I haven't really seen it in any study, but I think it's a nice topic of research.
Yeah, thank you for your answer.
Yeah.
Our time is up. So thank you, Emma, and thank you everyone who contributed to this excellent discussion. I'm stopping the recording.